We'll just have our panelists come up. I'm looking towards the back there, Peter. Whilst they're just coming up, I'll introduce myself a little bit better than I did earlier. My name is Nock. I'm the managing consultant for Fairmile West Consulting. We work in product and technical strategy and delivery in the TV field, primarily around video services and devices. And that's all I do, and that's why I'm here as the moderator. I'd like to take a seat there. Yeah, I'd rather not be the one in the middle. Right, so what I'd like to do first is to have each of you introduce yourself. So, Peter.
Thanks. My name is Peter. I live and work in Switzerland, although I obviously don't come from Switzerland. Like my colleague here, actually, I think I live and work in Switzerland and I don't come from Switzerland. And I work for a place called the European Broadcasting Union. It's well known for the Eurovision Song Contest, which we own. But it's also well known because we negotiate lots of sports rights on behalf of the European Broadcasting Union members, which extended, at least in the past, from Russia to Iceland and from Norway down through to Egypt. So we are a fairly large player in the sports rights market. We have just won the rights for the Olympics in conjunction with a commercial TV partner. And we are active in the streaming space for the purposes of distributing sports rights. What else? I don't work with the sports rights unit directly. I'm involved in the research and development side of the European Broadcasting Union. Yes, I think that's me.
Andrew?
Thank you for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for making it through to what I gather is one of the last sessions. My name's Andrew Ryan. I'm the Managing Director of a venture called FIBA Media, which is a partnership between FIBA, the World Basketball Federation. I know sometimes international basketball is a hard sell in the United Kingdom as opposed to the rest of the world, but rest assured we're quite a big deal in certain parts of the world. And the joint venture partner, DAZN, very much set up back when DAZN was Perform, a very, very broad-based sports digital entity. So we look after the production, distribution and commercialization of all of FIBA's primary sports properties. We're very lucky to have big events such as the World Cup for men and women. We had the World Cup for women in Sydney last year. We've got the World Cup for men coming in a combination of Philippines, Japan and Indonesia later this year between August and September, which will feature, for those of you who are basketball fans, all of the big NBA stars, and should hopefully be an incredible showcase of international basketball. So we will produce those events, everything from the FIBA Continental Championships, the qualification processes, Olympic qualifiers and the like, and sell them. And we will sell them to a combination of, or we monetize those through a combination of traditional television rights sales. We manage both betting and betting data and video rights. We will look after direct news access content. And probably the main reason why we're here today is actually relating to the use of what we call OTT rights. So they're rights that we specifically carve out of our media rights agreements to use on a non-exclusive basis on our own direct-to-consumer platform. And last year, just to make the whole joint venture space seem even more complicated, we entered into a partnership with Two Circles to run a product called Courtside 1891. And so it has become not just the official home of live streaming for FIBA, but we've expanded that service so it has live scores, schedules and data for over 200 professional or top tier leagues across the world. Live streaming from events like the BCL, the EuroLeague Women, ACB in Spain, but also highlights from probably about 12 to 15 leagues around the world. So it's a fairly comprehensive operation and certainly one which I'm sure we'll talk about a bit more today.
Thank you very much. So what I would like to do actually, this session, the key phrase from the description of the session was quality of experience. And I think we're going to take a very broad view of what that really means. And also we're going to try and explore the business drivers that ultimately result in a technology implementation a little bit here in an interesting way. So I suppose the key thing right now is to, what do you think of video quality, well, quality of experience, Andrew, when you're looking at it from your sports rights perspective? What's the key factors that come up in that discussion?
Sure, I'll probably take this to a slightly different angle than what.
Quite broad in our interpretation,
Yeah,
don't we?
yeah, extremely broad, and so very much for those of you who I'm probably not so much from your world of television in terms of the technical distribution and the like, but far more from the commercial and digital strategy side. So, in terms of quality experience, I guess going back to a fundamental tenet of FIBA's activity, it is to try to distribute content or particularly live coverage of our premier events to the broadest audience as possible, and obviously to balance that with generating revenue because of the fact that media rights still not the only asset that FIBA utilises. Obviously, sponsorship rights are a significant revenue pot as well, but the media rights sale to traditional broadcasters is something that still makes up a significant part of the revenue that allows FIBA to run many programs at home in Switzerland and throughout the rest of the world. So experience for us means the delivery of as much international basketball content as possible. As I said, we sell traditional media rights still, irrespective of the fact that we have an OTT direct-to-consumer platform. The sale of traditional broadcast rights is still such a significant part of what we do. Part of the reason, though, that we have the OTT service is because we have territories, for instance, like the Baltics or the Balkans or the USA and the like, where there is consumption or availability of virtually all of our content through broadcasters. On the other hand, we have territories, whether it's here in the United Kingdom or second-tier markets throughout Africa, Latin America and the like, where simply the entirety of our catalogue is not available. So that is part of the fundamental reason why, to give the best experience to fans possible in terms of watching what they want, when they want, that we started the OTT service. So it allows us to fulfill what we think is a consumer demand that in certain territories is probably not met at the moment. In terms of that experience to try to make watching international basketball as good as possible, as we saw from the presentation beforehand, that's something that we're much more able to control when it's happening on our own platform, as opposed to being delivered by one of our broadcast partners. So I'm sure there's many frequent users of Courtside 1891 in this room, knowing what fandom there is of the GB basketball team, that when you go on to watch any of those games, you will also be presented with live statistics and supplementary data that is still in its infancy in terms of that product and what we have planned for the next 3 to 5 years, but gives you an enhanced experience as opposed to simply just watching a linear broadcast feed, whether delivered through television or through a streaming provider.
Okay, thanks for that. And Peter, what about your more technical perspective on quality of experience?
So once we have the sports rights, it's all about trying to make sure that you can deliver a reliable service to the consumer. And that involves, typically for the larger sporting events, will involve multiple deals with multiple CDNs. It will involve trying to make sure that your DRM solution holds up at scale, and it involves trying to make sure, and the key factor in sports rights at the moment, particularly in the distribution aspect, is the latency of the service that you're offering. So you're trying to make sure that there is a minimum lag between any potential broadcast offering and any online offering, and in particular where you're mixing the distribution across different platforms and streaming is only one of them, then you need to be sure that you minimize the delay over broadband while not impacting on the quality of the picture and the quality of the service. So the consumer needs to be able to log into the service, get access to the service with a minimum buffer delay, and he needs to be able to have a good quality, reliable service over the period of time he's watching, and that's sometimes at quite extraordinary scales. And we've seen examples where for the tier 1 sports, there are some difficulties still remaining in operators that are distributing over streamed broadband services, where, for example, the service fails, there's too many user complaints. I think there was a classic example in Italy for this football season. And we note also for the World Cup that was held, where there were HD services being delivered for the UK market, HD services being delivered where there were some issues in the early matches that had to be resolved very quickly. This despite having all kinds of work carried out in order to estimate traffic, put in place all the necessary infrastructure. So, in summary, first of all, it's about making sure that the quality of the streams that are delivered at scale is reasonable for all of the consumers that wish to have access. And the second is about making sure that you have a minimum latency in order to ensure that there's a minimum lag between live and your stream service.
And how does this translate to the sort of business side of things, Andrew? You know, does this appear in the contracts for rights that there is actually these key quality criteria that need to be met?
So I guess in our key, so we still rely on satellite delivery for the vast majority of our live premium content. We've had various opportunities or have looked into the IP delivery as a supplementary or alternative option. There are some broadcasters that we do work on that format with, but the vast majority, when they're paying for top tier premium content, will still insist largely on delivery via satellite because there's such an investment that underpins that. So for us, it's less of a concern on that front. Certainly one customer group that is concerned about latency is betting partners who we work with. So we have an arrangement with a company called Stats Perform, who are our exclusive partner when it comes to exploiting and monetizing both betting video and betting data. Obviously, betting companies who invest in video, and that's almost, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, almost a sub-segment of sports rights that tend to be monetized alongside the more traditional media rights. Latency and minimizing latency is absolutely fundamental to the value of that content, because if you're delivering live betting video that sits 45 seconds, 50 seconds behind the actual live action, then the value of that as an accompaniment to trying to encourage in-game betting opportunities becomes less and less valuable every single moment that it's delayed.
And how does those quality criteria, and particularly the latency questions, how do you see them now being dealt with? Is it the mass market that has to have that betting performance level, or is there some combination of the two? Because obviously getting real time, basically sub 2 second delivery of content is difficult even on a broadcast network.
So certainly in terms of the betting market, it's distributed in a different manner than it is with the traditional broadcast market. So it's not a case that we're using the same piping or the same delivery as we do for the traditional media market, whether that's television broadcasters or streaming platforms who are essentially fulfilling that same almost consumer proposition as opposed to a betting proposition. So for the betting market, as I said, it's absolutely crucial. I think for the consumer market, latency has been coming down. Obviously, every time that you're increasing the specification of what you're trying to deliver, there are further challenges in terms of capacity use and delivery. But I think it's, if you go back 10 years when people were talking about how can this ever be a mass distribution pipeline and will people watch because it's sitting a minute behind the actual live action. I think we're sort of a long way past that. You've seen various broadcasters everywhere from the States to India or on a global level that have managed to achieve pretty efficient delivery of live streams to a relatively sizable consumer base and do that quite effectively. And that clearly won't do anything but come down in the future. So I think for the consumer point of view, there is no one who's sitting there at the moment and saying, I will not watch a sporting event on a streaming service based on the latency that exists at the moment. Peter may have a more educated, direct view on that. But
I don't know if it's more educated, but I think one of the key things is the latency introduced by CDN suppliers in this space. And one of the aspects that they're fully aware of is the need to speed up or reduce the latency on the different CDN services. And I know that latency is now considered one of the key criteria in terms of CDN performance. So it's something which is way up there on the agenda. It's not as high up the agenda as it would be for the betting community, but it's certainly way up there because the classic examples that I was discussing during the lunch break were the examples in World Cups and Olympics 10 years ago, where you would have a minute at least delay between what was streamed and what was available on broadcast. That's unacceptable these days. And the various different stakeholders within the value chain understand that. And there's lots of work being done on the CDN side to try and improve the performance of CDN in order to make sure to bring it up to the level of broadcast in terms of latency. Won't possibly ever achieve that, but they're getting pretty fast.
So what really is the sweet spot? I suppose that's the key thing. If we want a number, what is the target?
I don't have one. Maybe somebody in the audience has an idea in their head as to what the target is
Well,
in terms of seconds.
I have a little story about the fact that, you have people talk about, oh, you don't want to hear your next door neighbor celebrating the goal before you did because they're watching on broadcast and you're watching on streaming. Well, to that one, I normally say you need better insulation on your house. But there's also the fact that at the end of the day, that the key criteria for what we've got to beat now, for the stuff that can't be stopped by insulation, is actually got to be faster than Twitter, Facebook, or every other social media platform, which does drive it down into that sub 5 second bracket, really.
Yes and no. We're delivering a different service. The concept of someone, do I care that much if someone is on Twitter and takes 30 seconds to pump out, amazing last shot, Australia's won the World Cup? Probably not, because by the time if someone's scrolling Twitter at the time that is happening on TV, then they can't be too interested in what's actually being broadcast, whether once again through a traditional broadcast means or a streaming service. And I think when it comes to live video distribution, certainly that's a very, very different thing in terms of what Twitter, Facebook, anyone else in the social media scene is capable of. So I think, if you were talking, really, really significant delays, and particularly where you have the capacity to access something on social, whether in a text or clip format, yes, that does become a major issue. But at the same time, I don't, if you're at a crucial moment at a sporting venue, are you really sitting there on social media trying to check what's happened ahead of time? My instinct is that the vast majority of people, if they're sitting and watching something that is hugely invested in, try to stay the hell away from the score for as long as possible, knowing that you do have outcomes that can, happen a moment on social media beforehand.
When you distribute, so I shouldn't be asking questions, should I?
No, anyone can ask questions. I'm fine with that.
Swing it away.
Makes my job easier.
When you're distributing to your betting partners, is that done exclusively over satellite?
It's brought in by a satellite and then essentially sent out by. I think that actually I'll answer that question more fully. There are some events that are done by satellite. There are some events that are actually using IP delivery. It depends on the tier of the event and also the value that Stats Perform derive from that particular content.
So knowing what these sort of business drivers, Peter, what about the technical enablers of these things? What's in the streamers playbook?
So, clearly there's a whole set of technologies around low latency adaptive streaming, either over multicast, which would be ideal, or over unicast. So the Dash group have produced a set of low latency specifications, which are now essentially a common practice for all events, even the ones that aren't so time critical. And then the other stuff that happens is the black art of CDN supply. And what goes on in the black box that you call your CDN supplier. The issue that a number of organizations face is that if you use multiple CDN suppliers, there's no standardization in terms of the interfacing to the CDN suppliers, and there's no standardization in the data you get back from the CDN supplier in order to determine how well they're performing. So there's quite some difficulty. Each individual CDN supplier requires specific contracts, specific technical arrangements in order to feed them, and you need to have dedicated people watching each supplier in order to determine how well they're performing. And in any sporting event, you will have a situation where, particularly for a live sporting event and one of the tier 1 events at scale, you will have large teams of people keeping an eye on CDN performance and trying to predict when a CDN supplier may be reaching capacity, and therefore the need to switch to another supplier becomes evident. And managing that and your DRM is something that's really difficult. So there's a lot of rocket science in the CDN black box, and there's a lot of rocket science in how you manage your CDN switching. And there's a big discussion, live discussion at the moment, about how much data you need back from the client in order to be able to manage that. And that's a complex one, because where does the data come from? It comes from the player. Is the player controlled by the broadcaster, the media company? Is it controlled by the TV set vendor, or is it controlled by somebody else? And getting that data back in order to be able to appropriately switch your CDNs is something that's not obvious.
And you mentioned multicast there, and of course that's the key question that is a good quality experience piece. What happens when you max out? What's that issue? The last thing you want is black screen. So how does multicast give you something there?
So the thing about multicast is that it's possible, but it needs to be implemented by a number of the stakeholders within the chain. And what we're traditionally seeing is with the prevalence of on-demand viewing for most of the content, multicast becomes really important when you have live events. But for all the rest of the stuff, a unicast is just fine. And so therefore, what's the real reason you need to have multicast end to end for the purposes of just those live events? Significant, perhaps. So there's a range of things you can do in terms of having multicast at certain sectors of the chain in order to improve the distribution load that you have. But end-to-end multicast, not yet, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose the other key thing is, we're talking here about latency, but there's the dirty question, which I know about from some of my work, that the actual decode on the device itself, the actual reception, and basically play out on the device. It's not just whether it's how much it lags behind the content from the broadcaster, etc. It's also about the fact it plays out at different times on the device, depending upon many factors that are dependent upon how the player is architected. And that's a real consistency issue, because in one home, if you got one person in another room watching the same program and another person on a mobile device, having those a minute separated is not good.
No, and you also have a situation where the mobile devices and your desktop and your laptop computers are all updated regularly, whereas the TV set, the connected TV set in the house isn't really at all. I mean, there'll be some updates, mainly focused around security flaws that are addressed, but there's no upgrades in terms of features or whatever. So you're having to support a range of devices, yes, a range of generations of device, particularly in the connected TV space, and making sure that there's a consistent user experience across those different generations is far from obvious. And for my game, as a public service media organization, we're obliged to serve all those devices. Whether or not the TV set vendor continues to support them or not, we still need to make sure that you can see the stuff on the TV, and that's really hard.
Of course, there's an expectation for the viewer that they've bought something, they invested in it, they want it to continue to work. They don't want to have a TV after 2 years suddenly not be good.
Correct, and Samsung don't sell furniture.
That's true. Well, they do. TVs are furniture. We've already heard that one today from our Sky friends. So with all this is covering the live streaming aspect, but what about other modes of delivery of content? Andrew, what is there a world for streaming content, or basically for sports content in the on-demand world? Are you seeing something there? Is there something special there?
We hope so, because it's a reasonable part of our offering. I think on-demand viewing well, it certainly means an obvious thing, but in terms of what's actually consumed, it can mean many different things. So, for instance, and I'll take the example because we had in the presentation before, the NBA League Pass product, which sits in the NBA app, and which people might be more familiar with than what we have here. My on-demand viewing of that is very much driven by time zone elements, of the fact that those games happen in the middle of the night, European time. So when I wake up in the morning, I have some sort of on-demand experience with the NBA app. If I've got enough time, that might be watching a full replay of a game where I handily fast forward through segments that I don't particularly want to see. There's also the option of which we have through Courtside 1891, where you offer your consumers or subscribers various forms of condensed games, whether or not that is saying that we will give you an experience that sits within a 40-minute window or a 20-minute window, or down to your almost traditional highlights clips package that lasts for anywhere between 3 to 5 minutes. So I think that whether there is an on-demand market, of course, and in particular when you've got content that isn't happening in prime time of a particular territory or a particular region. I think the more interesting question is, how do you utilize the opportunity that sits with on-demand video to provide a product that is tailored to not just one consumer's need, but the varying needs of your consumers, and what is it that they will value? Because ultimately, if you're charging them a subscription fee, then you want to give them something that they look and say, this is bringing utility to my life, that allows me to watch my content in the easiest fashion possible and in a format which fits whatever time I've got available.
Okay. And we talked about looking at here at the quality of experience on the broadest sense. And the earlier presentation talked about data feeds. How critical is that to you?
Data feeds are critical in a lot of ways. I mean, first and foremost, that aside from video, that's what drives a lot of our service. So we want to have up-to-date scores, up-to-date box scores, up-to-date standings and the like from all of these top-tier leagues. Probably the trickiest part that we have with our data feeds is actually coming back to the latency point that we were talking about earlier today, because if you're having a set of statistics or a live score that's accompanying what's actually happening on the broadcast feed that's accessed through your product, you need to make sure that is commensurate with the timing of the game. So just as an example, when we first started our service, we had our data feed unfortunately sitting, a few seconds ahead of the game, simply because it was delivered in a much quicker fashion and we didn't have the timing completely right. So
you did your own spoilers, yeah?
We certainly did, but that's also something that was fixed pretty quickly, because obviously you will learn pretty quickly that's not a great user experience. So so certainly for us, being able to drive a product like Courtside 1891 with data which we have able to automate, essentially create hundreds of different, I guess, consumption experiences using that data and providing data for a range of leagues that we don't have video content from. It's a really, really important part of our offering.
What about technically enabling those data feeds? So I get the feeling that those data feeds, I suppose, what is there a standard for these things?
Unfortunately not. So we synthesized, I think it was 5, excuse me, maybe 6 now, separate data feeds to create the experience that sits on Courtside 1891. When you're just doing things as simple as live scores and the like, that's much simpler. There's still challenges in terms of bringing that all into the one product. When you start getting into box scores or standings, for instance, where particularly when you're working with a range of providers, that is not all consistent in terms of either the statistical categories or the presentation coming out in a particular fashion, that actually take quite a bit of behind the scenes work. So we have Pulse Live as our digital product provider, but we also work behind the scenes with a company called Sports Interactive, who are based out of India and have done a fantastic job in terms of actually bringing all of those data feeds and synthesizing them for our platform, so that what's spat out to the end user is hopefully a very, very consistent and reliable presentation.
And Peter, is there anything about that within your work area, about the data feed side of things?
So for sure, one of the things is that there's this thing called, and I don't know how relevant it is here, but I remember doing some work a while ago on the Olympic data format, the ODF, which was a metadata format in which the data is provided in. The difficulty is it's interpreted in different ways by different providers, and so just like Andrew, we had a load of hassle if we were running any sporting event in trying to aggregate the data feeds and making them available in a consistent format, and critically to time. So when we're running skiing events or whatever, then this is a huge factor. So we have teams of fellows that are focused just on the data feeds to try and make sure they're all consistent. There's supposed to be one format, but it's delivered in so many different ways.
I suppose consumed on many devices gets a completely different result as well.
This is it, and making sure that viewing experience is consistent across devices. But then there's real rocket science behind that, how that's done. So yeah, that's a problem too.
So it does add that consistency as a key criteria of quality of experience. It can be consistently poor, as in 40 seconds behind, but it's got to be consistent. Okay. What other factors, though, come out of this in terms of specific rights for particular sporting events, Andrew? Are there any out there that have got special requirements that come up only because of that particular one sport?
Sorry, only because of?
Well, is there a particular sport that has special requirements in terms of the way that quality experience affects it?
Intriguing question. Let me say, I think...
Are all sports the same? Is basically
no, that's the angle I was going to take it from, because I'm not sure I can give actually an intelligent answer to what you were probably getting towards. I think when it comes to whether or not it's the incorporation of data or other engagement opportunities through OTT services, or how you construct on-demand or near-live content distribution, there is a massive difference between different sports. And so I'll take, for instance, probably my two of my 3 main sports, basketball and cricket, you have literally hundreds of moments that happen in sports of those type that can be chopped up, that can be utilised at particularly given times, and will have, whether or not it's some sort of value or some sort of purpose. On the other hand, I know the UK is relatively fond of the game of football. You might only have, 2 or 3 massive moments in that game. And so take, for example, the value that sits with almost near live highlights, or the sort of highlights that are packaged up in Match of the Day, and that Sky makes available far more frequently now than used to be the case. They have a very, very different purpose, a different value that exists, as opposed to us showing a single three-pointer or a single slam dunk in a game of basketball, because we have so many more moments that are relevant to the outcome of a game, as opposed to those that happen to crystallise in a game of football at the moment of a goal or even a potential, a big save or something along those lines. So I think there's unfortunately, and we see certainly, I tend to speak more at sports industry at conferences rather than necessarily things of this nature. There's a really, really bad habit in the sports world sometimes to talk about sports as almost a generic product, where we should have a playbook that is very, very predictable and relevant, and it generally comes from the perspective of the person who's speaking, as opposed to necessarily thinking about all of these as different almost entertainment types, where the content therein has drastically different value at any given time, or depending on what product it's being consumed on.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the session now. I would like probably ask one last question to you both. It really comes down to, okay, quality of experience. What's the priority for the next few years for quality of experience?
Latency.
And Andrew?
Geez, that was too quick. I was trying to think about my answer in the meantime, Peter. So I think first and foremost, it was interesting in seeing the session we had immediately beforehand, that there are so many different fan engagement proposals that are being worked upon at the moment. We're quite lucky, as part of this partnership. We have a group called Two Circles, who are very, very good in the overall fan marketing and digital strategy sphere. So we get access to a lot of the sort of up-to-date thinking on this sort of thing. I think that will become... That will be important, but I think sometimes it's also overstated what almost proportion of the audience really wants to have live quizzes, live polls, data overlays that are interrupting their viewing experience. Actually, a decent proportion of people just want a relatively pure, high quality, brilliantly produced live sports production, and that's fine. It's just, I think because of the possibilities of streaming services, we've almost been forced to think of what else can happen here, and we're almost not utilizing the power of the fact that we have connected devices to serve this on, and that's great, and that conversation should absolutely continue, but we shouldn't get away from what is the fundamental proposition to fans, which is you can watch, at a high class, stream, television broadcast, whatever, however it's being distributed, and do it in a way in which is a fundamentally wonderful experience for the high proportion of people who want to consume it.
So if I sum that up, remember, it's the sports.
Absolutely. Never get away from the fact that your main product is not only the sport itself, but for everyone who tells me that fan-controlled camera angles are the next thing, I say to them, I would prefer to have my director, who is, an absolute genius at selecting the right shot at the right time, to control that for me, rather than relying on my ability to stub my thumb into a range of different angles, which will probably miss the best of what I'm actually after.
With my luck, if I had my own director I'd miss every single important shot. Okay, we have literally out of time. I don't know if there's maybe time for one question, if anyone wants to ask. Daniel.
Hi there, very interesting. Daniel from EPAM Systems. You're all distributors. Still, I'd be interested, production, so cloud-based production. Can you comment on that? How mature is that? Where are we there? I mean, a lot of the things that you plan that we've seen in Ed's presentation earlier require a more agile production, right? So where is that?
So there's a pile of stuff going on using generic 5G networks for 5G production, for production, remote control of cameras. So I'm located here in London. I'm controlling a soccer game, the cameras in a soccer game in Manchester. That all works. It can work. The issue is that for the premium sporting events, the value in making it work is not there yet. But for a lot of the other events, so tier 2 events and down, then it can work. And indeed, it's now an obligation because the production costs are so high. There's that large number of sporting events that you need to cover that in terms of practicalities, it becomes an obligation. So yeah, and it does work. Almost.
Yeah, I would echo that. I mean, we've used some form of cloud production in a number of host broadcast productions that we've done, particularly in locations where it's not necessarily easy to get experienced crews or the same quality of director and the like. But I think as Peter's hit the nail on the head, there's a lot of stuff where actually it needs to be done right. It needs to be perfect. You don't get second chances in sport, and for the time being, actually, that is still relying on a lot of on-site activity.
Okay. John, you detected something? Anyone's got more? There are no more sessions after this one in this room, so, you've got the time if you want to take it. No? Well, I guess you can all catch us somewhere next door or whatever for the drinks at the end of the day, maybe. I don't know. Okay, thank you very much indeed for your time.